Hey, Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about absorption. We're going to be talking about transmission, reflection, and those are the big ones, and diffraction. So basically, basic sound behaviors. I'm going to talk about these in later videos. It's very important that you have a basic grasp of these terms because they're just very, very basic, very useful. So first off, let's start off with transmission because it's the easiest one to do. So we have a sound source. We say something, transmission. The sound will go through it, through the object. It's like the object's not there. It just goes right through it. Now, the object will impart. It will never just let sound go right through it. There will be some degree of additional things happening, but some objects have very high transmission. For example, a sheet of paper probably has pretty high transmission, where it's like the sheet of paper does very little to my voice. Now, I am moving back and forth, and we learned about the inverse square law, so that also plays a role, and volume changes, and then we get the proximity effect of the microphone. So this isn't like just one effect happening when you hear a change in my voice, but if I were to stay at the same spot and talk at the same volume, you see that if there is any change, it's going to be in the really high frequencies of my voice. My low frequencies hardly touched at all, and this is so thin that the high frequencies really get through unscathed mostly as well. So that is transmission. Sound goes right through an object. Then there is something called absorption. So you remember that video where I had the piece of foam and I talked into this piece of foam, and again we had multiple things going on at the same time, but you could hear a substantial change in my voice besides the fact that I had moved away, and that is absorption. So there's two types of absorption. Well, two that I know of. There may be more, I don't know. There is one that's sympathetic vibration, or sympathetic resonance, my bad. Sympathetic resonance, that is when an object resonates. It's capable of moving. It's capable of resonating. There's bad resonance, where an object resonates with another frequency, actually enhances that frequency. And then there's this other kind, this deconstructive resonance, will actually ruin that frequencies. Well, not ruin it, but it will decrease the ability of that frequency to ring out. It'll actually absorb it. The way I like to describe it is, and this isn't my thing. I had an instructor tell me this one, but they were imagine you're in a concrete room. So you're in this room and you have a racquetball. You throw this racquetball. Your goal is to get this ball to bounce back and forth between these two walls, right? So you throw this ball and it bounces back and forth between the walls, and you get it to like go back and forth, I don't know, 3 times. Something like, oh yeah, woohoo. Now you are going to try and do it again, except for one of the walls has now been replaced with a trampoline. And something that we all know about trampolines is that trampolines have some take. So when you throw that ball against the wall, you're going to get it to hit that trampoline, and it's going to absorb some of it. And so it's going to resonate, essentially. It's going to move with the ball. It's going to actually take away some of the energy the ball had, and then it's going to bounce back. You'll get less bounces between the walls. Maybe the second time you only get 2, where before you could get 3. Because every time it hits that trampoline, the trampoline is going to take away some of the energy that ball had. And that's called sympathetic resonance. And that's one way of dealing with low frequencies, is we'll create things that sympathetically resonate with them in a way that is not constructive to it, and will actually allow it. So dimensions and things like that are pretty important, because you need to make it be a certain length so that things hit each other out of phase so they cancel. And so people will develop these sorts of acoustic treatments using sympathetic resonance. And typically you don't use absorption, which is, frictional absorption, for low end. You can, some really expensive studios do, but it's just a really sort of hard thing to do. And so it's easier, especially in a home studio, to treat it with sympathetic resonance if you're just trying to make your room sound okay. But the other type, of course, is frictional resonance. And that's when, frictional absorption. That's when you just have a material, and when you're talking to it, some amount of that different frequencies are going to try and, transmit, or they're going to try and reflect off of this material. And then the rest is going to be absorbed via friction. When we have sound going through the air, if I were standing like really far away from a source, the high end would go away first. There's actually, it gets a little complicated, because if it's a humid day, more high end would actually make it there. But accepting that if we're in a dry day, high end would actually go away faster, because it gets absorbed through frictional absorption in the air. Now, we can also take advantage of this by building absorbers. We can get materials such as rock wool, which are known for absorbing really well. They absorb a lot of frequencies really well. And then if you just make it really thick, the thicker it gets, the more of the bigger of a waveform you can affect. Because okay, we'll get into this when we get into diffraction here in a second. But there is, when small waveforms are high frequency. For high frequency, are smaller waveforms. As you get lower in frequency, the waveforms get bigger. So low frequencies are very big waveforms. Big waveforms present all kinds of issues because of diffraction. They can literally just bend around objects like they're not even there. We're going to talk about that. But with absorption, because they're so big, absorption tends to do this. Diffusion as well suffers, which we'll also talk about. So that's just something that you should be aware of. So if you want to absorb low frequencies, it's usually easier to get at it with sympathetic resonance rather than it is to get at it with just frictional absorption. But some rooms that are rather large, they'll have these big absorbers, and because they're so big, they can handle these bigger waves. And also very, very large rooms, standing waves become less effective in very large rooms because the waves are so big. And so we can get the standing waves to be really low, and by the time they get up to the higher range, they're just less effective. But of course, there's all sorts of other things that go into that. So that's the types of absorption. Now, the way material absorbs something. So I talk, and like for example, I have frequencies hitting my computer screen, and they're coming back at me. The way my computer screen absorbs certain frequencies over others is referred to as its absorption coefficient. And so the amount that it is absorbing. And you would actually use this absorption coefficient combined with a little bit of more information to determine. You could actually plot out a room response, taking into the account the walls and what they're made out of. And then you can add all these together and divide it by the volume of the room times that 0.049, this Sabine's number or whatever it is. And then you divide it and you actually get for a particular frequency, because what you'll do is your absorption coefficient is measured per frequency. So you can do this, and then you can find out, what the decay time at particular frequencies will be in your room based on the materials your room is made out of. And we could get even more complicated, but it's really kind of a cool deal. So next up, let's talk about, so you just need to be aware of absorption, the different kinds. Next up, let's talk about diffraction. Diffraction is really easy. So let's say that I've got, let's say we've got a USB audio interface. We want to make it, we want to see diffraction in action. Well, diffraction is when sound bends around an object. So low frequencies are really big, so they bend around objects a lot easier. High frequencies are not really big. So for example, if we have sound hitting one side of our head, it has a harder time diffracting or bending around our head, so that it's actually substantially quieter on the other side of our head. However, low frequencies are huge compared to our head. They can bend around our head no problem. Like no issue there. Yeah. So, and higher frequencies, since they're smaller, they have a harder time bending around stuff, so they can't do it as easy. I'm sort of laying down things in a really simple way, just giving you an idea. When people are saying, "Oh, that's diffraction" or whatever, they're talking about the way sound bends around an object. So. And that's also one reason why low frequencies are such a big issue again. Now, let's go to reflection, which is the last one, I believe. Oh, no, there's also diffusion. Reflection and diffusion are pretty much the same thing. So, but diffusion refers to it in a different way. So reflection is basically just sound that bounces off of an object. So I talk, and the sound reflects off of this object versus... and then there's transmission, that's the sound that goes right through, and then there's absorption, the sound that gets absorbed. And there's a couple different types of reflections. There's specular reflections and there's diffuse reflections. Specular reflections refer to, you can think of it as like you looking at yourself in a mirror. That mirror is reflecting the light, and you can see a clear image of what it is reflecting. It's a specular reflection. Versus if you were looking at like a wall, the light's hitting the wall, but you don't see an image of what's hitting the wall. The wall just gets brighter, and your room becomes brighter, but you don't have like a particular image. You could sort of think of it like that. So like delays are very, they're specular. You can see them quite easily. You know what the original content was based off the delay. But if we add a lot of reverb, it becomes a lot more diffuse. We have a harder time recognizing what the original content was. So you can think of it sort of like that. Then, that's that. Now, diffusion is the way sound is spread around a room. So it's sort of like reflection, only not really. And it's combined with other acoustical treatments. So, for example, let's say that I have a room and I've got standing wave problems in my room because I have these walls that are reflecting a particular frequency. So that's another thing. Certain materials will reflect different frequencies differently. So, and we're not going to talk about angular reflections and stuff like that because it's cool, but it's just not necessary to understand like this on a basic level. So we have things reflecting off, and different frequencies will reflect, while other frequencies will be absorbed, and some will transmit. So there's all this mumbo jumbo going on. And while all this is going on, we also have the sound bouncing off around the room, right? And as it bounces around the room, we can incur different issues. And so we'll use what's called diffusion to try and spread the sound more evenly around a room. It's a great way to try and eliminate standing waves. So let's say that we have a concave ceiling like this. Sound will enter this concave ceiling, and because of the way this ceiling is built, it will actually bounce around and it will focus around the center of this ceiling, and it will bounce straight down. So it'll come up, and it's much more likely to get to the center, the wave will. Now remember, sound is a wave. It's not the single line like we sometimes make it out to be. We're looking at a more general pattern. So most of the sound will end up here and bounce down. So this will focus it. If we concave it like this, picture this as like a concave thing. Here's a wall, and this is like sitting on the wall. So this would be called the polycylindrical diffuser. And what that means is as sound hits it, now there's even more. We get into angles and depth and all sorts of other things with diffusers. But basically when sound hits it, it's going to bounce, and it's going to bounce away in all these different directions. This is going to really diffuse the sound. So there's a couple schools of thought on this, but don't worry too much about it. It's basically just the way it's spreading sound around the room. We could like talk about the depth. We could talk about, what dimensions is this spreading the sound in, and the frequencies, because what's your diffuser made out of? Because if you're going to make the goal with most diffusers is some companies will try and do diffusion and they'll do diffusion and they'll do absorption in the same thing. And usually it's not a great idea. You want something to either be, it's better to isolate the treatment. So this is just a diffuser. So you try to get it to respond evenly to all the different frequencies, because then you get these weird combinations. But then some people deal with the thickness to therefore determine the reflection. So however much it absorbs will therefore determine also how much it reflects. There's that school of thought. And then there's also this thing called phase grading, which we're not going to talk about. There's other objects. New technologies are always coming out. But anyways, diffusion, how sound spreads around a room. Diffraction, how sound bends around an object. Reflection, how sound bounces off an object. Absorption coefficient, how a particular object absorbs sound. And I believe that's it. Oh, and resonance is how sound resonates when excited by a frequency, or in our case, we want it to resonate in a way that's deconstructive, so we can use it to do that. So I'm sure if you've ever jumped on a trampoline too, you've had that one jump where you would go flying, but then you've had other jumps where someone steals your jump on a trampoline and you feel gypped. That's also an example of ways resonance can be constructive or deconstructive. If you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe, support me on Patreon, and have a blessed day.